John. And just as a quick reintroduction, I am so excited to have John here because he has definitely been a big influence on my life. I just went to my bookshelf. These are all books that I just ate up. Here's Forgiveness, about the nickel mines Amish school. Maintaining the Right Fellowship, which is all about Franconia conference or Franconia area. 'Twas Seeding Time, which is John's view of the revolution from Mennonite eyes, which is super interesting. I think I've read this one 3 or 4 times. And then here's Conrad Grebel, Son of Zurich. Conrad being, Leonard's got one up there too. The Earth is the Lord's. This one is about one of the 3 founders of the Anabaptist movement. And this is interesting because John actually posed for the picture of Conrad there. So you might see a little bit of resemblance. Anyway, John, welcome back. We're so grateful to have you.
I'm grateful to be here and to have, this is, I think I said this last time, but I'm still getting over this. Jesus said, where 2 or 3 are together in my name, I'm there. And that's where we are now. We're together in Jesus's name. And Jesus is here with us. And I want to look at the story of where we had no story. And we should have had narrative. Somebody should have written up things that we were just too busy, too happy inheriting this new land and celebrate now and then saying that we are in the lap of our lots have fallen in pleasant places. And we're at a time now when it's creeping into our consciousness. My book is not innovative. It is part of a rising consciousness, and it just gives voice to, and it's stringed together so that you don't just have a collection of data, but you have a narrative. And that was my work, to put a narrative there. And if you put data down and you put it in chronological order, which is so easy to do with the computer now, all of a sudden the narrative stares from the screen out at you. You don't invent it. It's been there waiting for you. And it needs to be told. And the narrative that is in the DNA of the remaining Lenapes, whether it's the 10,000 of them in Oklahoma, or some of them up in New York State, or even up in Grand River Valley in Ontario, or New Jersey, or Delaware, it's there. And it's encoded there. And with grief, knowing that at once they had a relationship to the land that was then imposed on, a pattern was imposed on it that replaced their own narrative. And the Lenape language, amazing. The vocabulary itself, I'm told by a friend of mine in Oklahoma, who has the so-called Lenape talking dictionary online, says that the Lenape words encode direction and even lots of times sequence in the way you pronounce the endings of words, which is something that is foreign to us. Anyway, I want to say just a couple of things. When you, all I had to do was comb through old ledgers and old deeds, as I said, and place those things in a sequence, and then electrons start firing back and forth between them. Meaning emerges where there was just data. If you have finished my book, in my epilogue, I talk about the time when we built a wall of memory here in Lower Salford for our Heritage Center. And I talked about 3 stones. One was from an African-American stone cutter. Another was a stone to pound hominy with that I found here along the Branch Creek. And another one was a piece of petrified wood from Africa in the shape of the African continent, brought home by an African missionary. And we put all those stones in the wall of memory, but none are visible because the long pestle, the mason saw a nice little hole like this and stuck it in the long way. All you see is this at the end. So it says nothing to you. And he saw a nice place for a stone with rectangular with one corner off. So he took the African American's beautiful rectangular stone and knocked the end off of it and stuck it in there so it doesn't carry its message. And the petrified wood from Africa, he had a space that looked like South America. So he flipped it and put it in there. And now you look at all that data, it tells you no story, just the pattern we imposed on it. And that's the way I feel we looked at. Now I just look at the Lenapes. Now the Lenapes are a small group. They lost 75% of their peoplehood to smallpox before William Penn ever came. So they're a fragile remnant. And furthermore, by the time my ancestors came that bought this land, they were already reported as having moved from the Delaware Valley, past the Schuylkill, out to the Susquehanna. And my narrative then follows them on out past the Juniata to the Ohio and Allegheny, and then on into Ohio. And wherever they went with their hunting and fishing culture, now, however, with the gun instead of just the arrows, wherever they went, the settlers were right behind them. They couldn't move fast enough. And so when they were finally told by the French, who were competing with the empire of the British, who thought it would be for French North America, when the French said, look what you get out of the English. What do you get? Nothing. You have to keep moving. And then when the English sent over a bunch of soldiers to march up to the Ohio and the Monongahela, we call it Pittsburgh, and the Indians just picked them off from the bushes, the French said to the Indians, see how easy that was? You even got the general and buried him right there. If you chase them back to the shore, we'll have your back. And the Indians, the Lenapes, they bought that. They said, okay. And you know who was sent up by the land speculators into Western Pennsylvania to take over? A young guy named George Washington. He ended up with hundreds of thousands of acres. And the Indians had none. And it just did not compute to them. And I want to say one other thing. And sure, they were savages after that. Wow, were they ever? But I could tell you stories of savagery of white people to Indians too. But I want to say this. This is a book about land. Hans Ruth, that would be Rogers and my ancestor, was driven out like the Ukrainians are flocking out now. Hans Ruth and I don't know who, 600 or 700 people, Staufers, they walked up 200 miles from Bern, Switzerland, up to the area along the Rhine River near Worms, where there were an older colony of people who were tolerated by the Prince Elector of the Palatinate. And they went up there and then they moved over a little bit to the Neckar, and I won't go into all that, but they walked up there by foot with a blanket and not much more. So then they regathered under the toleration, not the high approval, but the toleration of the elector of the ruler of the Palatinate under the Holy Roman Empire. And when they, I tried to track how in a generation or two later, they heard the news from William Penn. And you know, what shocked me, even as I read the old, was that William Penn knew about him. He had been at Kriegsheim, which is just next to the village where the Clemenses lived, that bought the land I'm sitting on now. He had been there, he worshiped with them. And the Quakers had converted some of those Hendrickses and shoemakers and I just forget castles and made Quakers out of. And they got to Germantown before the Mennonites did. The Mennonites came a generation or two later. But Penn had been there. He knew about it. And what really shocked me was to find a letter in which when Gerhard Clemens and Henry Culp and Michael Ziegler came over here in 1709, Penn was an old, tired man then. But he put a little letter, it wasn't big, on the boat that brought them over. And this letter was to be read by his secretary in Philadelphia. And this letter, which I found in Philadelphia, it's not even in the collected letters of Penn. So it shocked me when I saw it. He said, here come the Palatines. They're sober people. He knew all about them. He said, they're divers. Penn had been with the rich Mennonites of Amsterdam. He had been in the Palatinate with them. He heard about the Swiss coming down in chains down the Rhine, expelled. He said, they're sober. And he said, they will neither fight nor swear. And Penn wouldn't either, you know. And he said, treat them with tenderness and love so that they will send over a good character. He wanted more of us. And this is the land I live on. But when I discovered that, I started getting narrative. I started getting visceral feelings. You know, I'm no expert. I'm not really a historian. I'm just a storyteller. I was trained in literature. And here I spent my main years teaching Shakespeare and T.S. Eliot and whatnot. And I didn't know my own story. And I felt I was smart because I was getting a PhD in the macroculture. And I didn't know my own story. What a rush of irony came over me working on this. Anyway, why am I doing all this? One other thing. And then when I found, when Gerhard Clemens came over here, 1709, he was here about 8 years, had a chance to get some equity. And when 3 boatloads of Mennonites came in the 1717, 9 years later, he was ready to buy some land. And a speculator who was a surveyor, when he saw those boats unloading in Philadelphia, the summer of 1717, the light switch went on and he said, somebody's going to make a bundle here. Somebody's going to deal. We're going to open up some vacant land up there above the Skippack yet. And so he said, I'll take 3,000 acres. Okay, they knew him, say, okay. But he didn't put his down money down. And he didn't even sign it. He said, I know the commissioners for property. I know they trust me, I trust them. And he came to the Ruths and the Ladrocks and the Rifes and the Clemenses and sold them land. He sold Gerhard Clemens 690 acres. He said it was 585, but it was sort of confusing. But they didn't have enough money. They didn't have enough cash to pay what he wanted, which is about 4 times as much as what he paid within less than a year. And he said, I'll tell you what, just give me IOUs. because I know you people, you're trustworthy. And they were. Give me for what you don't have. And I'll give you. And he made up what looked like deeds, and they weren't. He made them up and he gave it to them. They couldn't read English. They trusted him. He was a Quaker. And after about 2 years, the officials from Philadelphia said, "Hey, Mr. Powell, where's your money? Your 300 pounds. You didn't put your first 100 or your second 100 down." "Oh, here," he said. And he handed in the IOUs that the Mennonites gave him. He had spent their cash. And so William Penn's secretary said, "Call those fake deeds in and give them real deeds. And that's, we know these people are honest and trustworthy people," he said, "so they'll pay, but give them real papers so we can settle this crooked affair." So here I am living on what was a crooked affair. I'm celebrating. Oh, how nice it all is. So the longer I read these old papers and put them together, the more I thought we're irresponsible when we don't know our own story. I don't know why I get carried away on this. I got to say one more thing. When the Mennonites, Penn bragged about how nice it was over here. He said, "There's springs, there's fish." He could hear fish leaping in the Delaware from the house he lived in. And he talked about the fruits that grow wild. Well, the Indians knew all about that. He bragged about it. And then the first record we have of Mennonites reacting to the countryside came in 1710, a year after Greville came. Clemens came. The Lancaster Mennonites. There was a Quaker watching them, and he kept a diary. And he said some of them got off the boat and walked along as the boat came up because they were so anxious to see what the land was like. And he said, they brought us fruit. It was the fall of 1710. And he said, they said it was the finest and best fruit they had ever eaten. And he said they looked at the land and they were greatly, I can't quote it exactly, with the fineness of it, looking at the land. Well, now it turn around and look at the land through the Indian eyes. It fed them. It fed them berries and nuts and fruit and tubers. And it was their, not just their pantry, but it was their pharmacy. And they knew it all. But here come people that if they gave them furs, would give them guns and Jew's harps and scissors and gunpowder. Well, sure, we can give you beaver. It just went like this. It went past each other. And anyhow, a guy told me at church this morning, he said, as I read the book, he said, I have to set it down and think a while. That's fine. We have one of our members says, I can't read it in the evening because then I can't sleep. And you know what? One guy told me, he said, I read it 5 times because he said, I only get some of it every time. Okay, I'm rambling here. I'm so happy to have Marvin Craker on. Are you still on, Marvin?
I'm on, yes. I'm happy to hear your voice. I should say that I haven't read it 5 times yet, but I have read, he was kind enough to send me some of the drafts of his earlier chapters. And it's a very timely book, timely in many ways, but Mennonites are are discovering the doctrine of discovery now, and discussions going on about that. But I think the one thing about John's book, he is telling the story from the Indian viewpoint, the Indian perspective, the Indian, and that is, he's not the first one to do that, but it hasn't been many years ago when this was rarely done, maybe 20, 30 years ago, when I was studying Indian history at the University of Oklahoma, they didn't talk about the doctrine of discovery, but they did realize and start seeing events from the Indian point of view. So that is a very critical, crucial, and timely, and I hope many of our Mennonite people will read this book.
Well, you know, Marvin wrote a book too. And he also was on a trip with me over there. And as I was writing this book, I remembered that. And gave him a call, and he was kind enough to write a blurb for the back cover. And but what was your group of Indians, Marvin? Now,
the Comanche Indians, the Plains tribe, the Comanches. Yeah. The Mennonite Brethren had their first foreign mission program was to the Comanche Indians of Oklahoma.
Okay, well, would there be any topic or question that anybody would bring up? I can talk, no problem, but if you'd like me to get on any particular topic.
Well, here's a question that was put in the chat.
Okay.
Any discussion about rituals, laments, events to honor the Lenapes and some of the history that happened?
I mentioned it in my epilogue. I went to two of those. One was in the National Cathedral, packed with hundreds, thousands of Indians of all tribes on the 500th anniversary of Columbus's discovery in 1492, and packed. And the people who spoke were of Indian leadership, including the Mennonite Lawrence Hart. And I tell in that my epilogue that my wife and the wife of a Lenape leader from Oklahoma by accident got swept up in the procession and wound up in the front seats. The chief and I, we couldn't even get a seat anywhere. We had to stand somewhere. But they had these powerful, loud drums. I mean, loud, overwhelming, which was a kind of a celebration. As Zinzendorf, when he preached to them out at the Susquehanna, said, "Stop that drumming so I can preach." But here, the drums had the floor. And you heard something, you felt it, the vibration in your ribs almost. They had something to say too. And you know, another thing about Penn, he said, he didn't say these are the pagan rites. He said this is their canticos, whatever he meant by that, but it's their worship. And twice, both in Lancaster County and in Bucks County, there was an oral tradition that when Penn was at an Indian drumming session, he got up and one woman said he beat them all dancing. Well, that was in Washington, D.C. And another time was about 10 years ago in Lancaster County. I was at a Presbyterian church where they remembered the Paxton Massacre. And there was a full of Pennsylvania Indians there that night. And they had a cloth that they were waving. Up front in this Presbyterian church was this big Christian cross. But they were waving these, I don't know what you would call them, and wailing. I didn't put it in my book, but one of the local traditions here was that a wailing was heard along the Branch Creek when the last of the Indians were about to leave, and they were going to leave behind an old woman. She wouldn't go. And so a local Mennonite went down to the branch and took her and let her live at their house until she died, and talks about how she ate turtles and told the children when it thundered that the Great Spirit was angry. We have little lore like that. But anyway, at that, that was another celebration I was at. And that's a good, whoever asked that question is onto something. I think we need something like that around here, Montgomery County. We name it the Indian Creek. We have the Indian Creek Reformed. We have the Indian Creek Brethren. We have the Franconia used to be called Indian Creek. We have the Indian Souderton Indian football team. We have Indian Valley. It's all Indian. And when we celebrated our 300th anniversary in Lower Salford a couple of years ago, there wasn't even any mention of the Indians. So we should do something. I could go on about that, but maybe about something else.
So it's another question from the Zoom audience. Leonard, it looks like you're about to ask a question. Is that true?
I was just going to ask John if he's working on another book.
No, another book is working on me.
Okay.
I don't want to write any more books. Now, it used to feel like it was my initiative to write a book. Now it seems like a book has to be written.
Mhm.
And I don't know who will give it voice. So I would do it out of obedience rather than, this book was written out of curiosity.
Mhm.
Why was there a blank screen in front of me about this story? What kind of people are we when we have a bargain basement version of our story? What does that say about us? And I think, was it last time? Yeah, I mentioned that looking at this story from Indian eyes has made me look at the Bible differently.
Mhm.
And has made me say, am I looking at it through Jesus's eyes or whose? When I found out that, bury my heart at Wounded Knee with Custer talked Pennsylvania Dutch. His ancestors were Mennonites here. That's part of our story too.
Mhm.
But I never bothered to put it together. The data's there. Never bothered to, till I'm an old man and I'm past my, when I could write more interestingly than I can now. Now it's drudgery, but I have to do it out of obedience, not out of pleasure. Writing never was much pleasure anyway.
I'd like to say that I tried to get John to leave that out about Custer. I didn't, I've been teaching Indian.
Tell them about that. Tell them about that. Explain your convictions there.
Well, I'm not a great fan of Custer, and I always, have been not impressed with him at all. And so I heard that somebody had claimed that he was a Mennonite, came from Mennonite origins. Jim Yonke of Bethel College tried to refute that, but John convinced me in the end that he's right, I guess, that he was probably a Quaker and then became Mennonite, or Mennonite and then Quaker. I don't know which.
No, first there were Mennonites.
Okay.
But Marvin wanted to hide that fact from my audience.
Well,
And I think,
there's
but Marvin,
some embarrassing things we could leave out,
but Marvin told the truth in his book. And he told me a story that I put in my epilogue about when the Cherokee land rush was, when the gun was fired, a Mennonite man took off driving his wife sitting in a wagon, and with a stake in her hand, they're going to get their claim,
Correct.
And so He finally sees what he wants. He turns around and says, "This is it." And she's not in the wagon and she fell out. So she put the stake there, and that was the Mennonite homestead. And that's funny. And then I said to myself, I wonder what a Comanche or a Lenape would have thought of that story. Would that be funny?
No,
But they celebrated, I'm sure. Thank you, God, for this claim.
yeah,
And hey, I'm not angry at us. I think I'd have done the same thing if I was with them in that generation. What's the use of talking down to them? And furthermore, let me say something about this book. You mentioned Doctrine of Discovery. We're all past that now, and we all think how terrible it was. All I'm doing is laying out the story. I'm not arguing for one side or another. I'm just telling what happened. I'm that far back in the process. You know what I mean? Why are we starting debating ideology before we even know the story? That's the way I feel.
Well, unfortunately, the half hour has passed, and boy, it would be so great to continue this discussion. It's been so wonderful to have you with us, John. We appreciate it very much. The book again is This Very Ground, This Crooked Affair. And I would also highly recommend it. As we depart, I'd just like to acknowledge that we at Hyde Park are living on the traditional lands of the Shoshone, Bannock, and Northern Paiute tribes. And John, thanks so much for bringing this to our attention.
It's my privilege. God be with you.
God be with you.